thank you. Happy to see all your happy faces this morning. So yes, I did a repatriation project. I repatriated 255 West Mexican artifacts to Mexico. And it pretty much started on my first day. So I'm going to give you a little history of, a very brief history of Parthenon, because a lot of people don't know what it is and the fact that it's even there. So the Parthenon was first built in 1897 as a temporary building as part of the Centennial Exposition to celebrate the 100th birthday of Tennessee. The Parthenon was picked because before we were ever known as Music City, we were called Athens of the South. So they decided that that would be the perfect shiny little example right in the middle of the whole park. So it was only meant to stand for 6 months. But everyone loved it so much, they decided to keep it up. So after October, when everything else came down, this building stayed up until about 1920s, when it was in terrible disrepair and needed to be fixed. The whole city got together and decided to rebuild it. So that picture there is it being, with scaffolding, is it being rebuilt in the 1920s. And it was reopened in 1931 as the cement building that we have now. And it was opened as an art museum and history museum. So that Athena came later in the 80s and then later was gilded in the early 2000s. So fast forward quite a few years to 2022, and I walk in and my director shows me my new domain, and I'm going in thinking I'm going to see all this, Greek stuff and Centennial history, and then there's 2 shelving units full of West Mexican art. And I'm like, well, that's got to go home. That can't stay here. So that may have been a naive thought, having no history of or experience in repatriation, but that's what I decided to do. So I delved into the records and discovered that they came from 2 separate donors, Dr. John Montgomery and Edgar York. I have no information on Edgar York, but I had a lot of one-sided conversations between Director Parker, who was the director at the time, and John Montgomery. So I know, according to the records, that John Montgomery went to Mexico, possibly did some excavations, got some stuff, brought it back, and donated it to Parker after they made a friendship and a big deal about it. So I'm going through all of this, and I realized that during that period when they rebuilt the Parthenon, that's when Metro suddenly owned the land and the building. And for some reason, even to this day, I don't have a clear answer on. They didn't lump us in with Art Commission. They made us part of Parks and Rec, which means we're lumped in with the golf course or the water park. So that means if I want to get rid of anything in my collection through deaccessioning, the proper way to do it, I have to actually follow Metro rules, which means I have to surplus it, like a spare chair or extra desk. And I'm like, that's not going to happen, guys. It's just not how this is done. So after, and I'm going to truncate this a lot, but talked to Metro Legal, got a lot of advice, a lot of support, and had to explain what I was doing multiple ways, in different ways, a lot. I finally got them to understand what was going on, and I had Metro Board approve the deaccessioning of the objects. But now I need to get them repatriated. That had to go through City Council. Luckily, I had a lot of support there as well, and that happened on May 7th of this year. In that process, I realized no one knew what I was talking about. No one knows what repatriation is, and if they do, they think about the British Museum or the Met and all the really negative stuff that you hear. And people are getting this opinion that it's a bunch of museums and stodgy institutions that are not wanting to return anything. That's not the case. I know there are staff members out there who want to do something, but they're hitting all these problems, same as what I'm doing. So we decided to do an exhibit. So after I got the approval, I was like, well, I don't know anything about West Mexican artifacts, so I started talking to archaeologists like Vanderbilt. And I knew I wanted the community involvement, so we started talking to the Latino community. We got their opinion and what they wanted, the artifacts to look like in an exhibit. And I learned that a lot of what they wanted to know, I couldn't give them because I didn't have that information. So, in order to do that, so after talking to them, I came up with this group of things, these goals I wanted to keep in mind. I wanted people to know what repatriation was. Not get too deep into it, but enough so that they can start thinking about it, starting to talk about it, and get involved in some way. I wanted to go over the laws a little bit, but not enough to bore them, because you don't want to bore people. The laws can be very boring, and there's a lot of them involved. Wanted them to know the kind of actions that museums are taking. I also wanted them to know that it's not just museums, it's private collectors, it's governments, it's all of that. I wanted them to see how the community was responding to this, if they are enjoying it. I want the community to be involved in it. And I want them to know that this is still going on. So of course I had to bring up the elephant marbles, Parthenon marbles as well. And that's how I formed this exhibit, with all these in mind. So, give you a little idea of what the exhibit was. So I have my little friend here, El Jefe, I call him. I picked 61 artifacts out of the 255, and I put them in 5 cases. I had so many arrowheads, I couldn't just have a big case of arrowheads. So I picked some hand tools that I had, some effigies and some ceramics. There was also what's called an ocarina, which is a bunch of whistles, essentially, of different sizes and makes and everything. They're all fabulous. I miss them very much. And I realized I also didn't want to do the thing where you have a whole bunch of things with a whole lot of information that I can't really verify. I don't have any information on these pieces because they were essentially taken from their home without any kind of archaeological context whatsoever. So instead, I made that part of the exhibit, the lack of knowledge. And I gave a little 100-word or less label, Spanish and English, explaining this is what we think they are, and this is the kind of influence we've seen. Like ocarinas, you can see those in video games today. There's a scene in a Monty Python movie where they show up. Stuff like that. And with ceramics, point out we can learn a lot of things from ceramics, but I can't tell you anything about these things. So I pointed that out. I made that part of the exhibit. Then on another wall, I had different examples. Iraq is Hobby Lobby and how they've been in a lot of trouble for taking things away from Iraq. And different solutions, such as the Chrysler Museum had these things called vaganga, which are tall wooden, kind of like grave markers, but to them they house the soul of the person who's deceased. So one of my favorite quotes is the director says, we're not in the business of curating souls. So the whole museum decided to return them. But by doing that, they knew that these pieces were going to be put out in the weather to disintegrate, which is kind of against what you do as a museum person, which is protect and preserve. So when you do these repatriations, you have to accept that once they're out of your hands, that's it. So that's kind of a hard thing to do. But I was so proud of this museum for doing that I had to point that out. Egypt had a mummy at the Niagara Falls Museum. They thought it was royal. They since have learned, after I put this up, unfortunately, that it wasn't, but it did get returned home. Yemen is a very interesting case because they have a lot of things returned to them, but they can't return them to the country because they're in a civil war. So they worked out a deal with the Smithsonian that the Smithsonian is holding on to it, can even have an exhibit about it. Really great museum exhibit if you get a chance to see it. And they'll hold on to it until things are safer in the country. One thing that really stuck out for me though is the monolith. Now this is where I got the idea to 3D print some of the pieces. Because one of the things the community would say to me is, well, once these are gone, when do we get a connection to it? Well, you don't. But if you 3D print it, you have something. So we did that. So they did the same thing. So I'm going to actually pass around for you to see a couple of pieces that we had 3D printed. And keep in mind that as I give it to you, you have all the information I had and had to give an exhibit about it. So these pieces we are using for educational purposes, things like this. I get to hand them around. I love watching the people, everybody lights up when they see the Kalima dog. They usually give him a hug or a pet. He's kind of become our emotional support animal at work. But this is a way of keeping the community connected. It's making it also, because this is now a piece of our history as a building as well. It's part of our story, so we get to keep that part of our story. And yeah, we're pretty proud of that. So from that, we are going to be doing a lot more things. My next project is the 3D print Athena and bring her down to a level where people can interact with her physically. So. My favorite part out of the whole thing was getting to talk to José and having José as part of the exhibit and having him bring in the community, the voice of the community. So I'm going to have him come up and talk about this bit. So José, tell us about your art and how it affected your community and your collaboration with us. I'll go over here. We did not coordinate.
Buenos días. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you so much for staying here in an important building and beautiful building. My name is José Vera González. I'm from México, el estado de Michoacán. El impacto que tuvo esta ocasión fue muy importante para mí y para la comunidad.
Thank you very much for having us over here. My name is Susie Vera. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Susie Vera, the wife and the translator of Mr. Vera. He speaks English. He understands most of it, but to be more clear, but he says that the impact that this had for our community, it was very strong.
La importancia de un impacto en tu vida.
The importance of an impact in our lives
Es que te sorprendes.
is that you get surprised.
La mayoría de las veces.
Most of the times you get surprised.
Entonces lo que hizo Bonnie, un gran trabajo para lograr una repatriación, es la honestidad y ética.
He says what Miss Bonnie did over here, it was very honest. It was
Professional ética.
she had had a very high professional ethic.
Y cuando logras que el mundo vea tu trabajo, ese es impacto.
Oh, and when you achieve that the world sees your work, and that's how you create an impact.
Yo vi muchas caras contentas que se ponían y se trasladaban a aquel tiempo de las piezas arqueológicas.
He says that he saw in our community a lot of people that got transported and they saw their faces in our ancestors.
Ese también es un impacto, porque aprende y se sienten. ¿Y cómo es posible que piezas de más de 3.500 años las puedan ver de cerca? Para mucha gente.
En este caso sería como tu experiencia, ¿no?
Pero la gente no puede.
Okay. Pero en este caso sería, bueno, platiquemos de tu experiencia mejor, de cómo fue. I'm asking him to talk about the experience, because I want to really, and this is very important, this is something that I want to point. When Bonnie called us, when she called us to, she was calling him first, and he didn't answer because he thought it was like a spam call. He was like, "Oh, this is a spam call." But then she wrote a message to him. He's like, "This is Bonnie from Paternal. We have some pieces, some pre-Columbian artifacts that I want you to come and see, and we want to do an exhibition." And we were at some event, and he was like, read it again. And I'm like, let me see. So I read it, and yeah, this is real. We were super excited. My husband, we are both from Mexico, we're from Michoacán. He's very patriotic, I would say. We're Mexicans, of course, like a lot, but he loves Mexico in a way that he puts it on all his paintings. And a lot of people, if you have seen a search or if you have time to search some of his work, very colorful, very folklore, very So he puts his love in his art. So when we went and met with Bonnie, he was like kind of shaky. He's like, I can't believe that I'm doing this. When we went and she showed us the cases, when she opened them, it was that's part of our history. Seeing in those boxes, he started crying, then she started crying, and then I started crying because this is the impact. Then not just
Toqué piezas de más de...
we touched pieces more than I don't know how many years, but we know that it's historical.
Y eran artistas.
And that they were artists. This is
Porque hicieron
pieces
a
they
mano.
were carved, they were hand carved
Entonces, ese es un impacto.
by another artist, you know, years and years ago. So here he is, because he's an artist, so he does his like, it was very emotional. And we saw that same feeling among our community. And this is something that we had our grand opening, right? So we had, I called Bonnie, remember I said, Bonnie, how many people can we get in the paterno for the grand opening? Because we told our friends and they were very excited, people that we knew. Everybody was so excited to see an exhibition, to see part of our history in a place that, if you go to Mexico, the, ¿cómo se llama? Museo de Arte? Yeah, if you go to Mexico, the museums, you are able to see pieces but far away. You're not able to see them this close. So people were super excited. And I called Bonnie, I'm like, how many people can we have on the reception? She's like, well, usually no more than 200, we say, right?
Usually we get about 200, 300 to a reception. This one broke a record. We had almost 500 people. I haven't broken it yet. So.
And it was
Very
amazing.
humbling.
All the people that came, all the people that saw, we saw people crying, not just us, other people.
El impacto que tuvo, la importancia de esto es que se hizo algo histórico en los dos países.
He says the impact or the importance of this impact is because something historical was done in both countries. You know, United States, Mexico, this is.
En especial Tennessee.
And it was especially from Tennessee.
Por el gran trabajo
From the great
de
work
investigación
of Church,
de Bonnie y su equipo.
of Bonnie's work and your
Eso
and
es
the team.
otro impacto que
So
se
that's
logra.
another impact that
Entonces, para la comunidad de las dos partes fue de gran importancia y se quedó en la memoria de todos.
this is, and then for, of course for the community, that's a great impact for both of the communities, not just us as Mexicans, but for other people that came and saw the exhibition. We had different races, different races. It was beautiful because when people were taking pictures, we saw people from different nationalities. And that was, I mean, for me, it was amazing because I remember being in the reception and we had guacamole, we had a bunch of dishes because we have friends and they're like, oh, what do you want? We'll go ahead and send you some food. And we had like really, really good food. But it was, you have all these nationalities. So this impact helped us be at this place. We were just one culture. We were just, you know, it just felt good.
Así, cuando se logra una repatriación, los países quedan contentos porque siguen construyendo su historia.
Oh, this is when a repatriation creates this impact. Our countries, they're happy and they want to continue making history.
Porque alguna pieza, y no nada más de México, de otros países, puede ser una pieza clave para algún dato importante en su historia del país.
Because he says that maybe one of these pieces, one of these artifacts, not just from Mexico, but from any other country, one piece, it's a key point for history in any country. You know?
Entonces, la intervención del arte actual con el arte del colombino es otro impacto porque imagínate ver los nuevos materiales con los que se hace el arte ahora y los antiguos materiales con los que se hacían antes.
This is and now therefore like for now the interference, how do you say that word? Interference from Asian art to actual art, and then you see how it's made. You know?
Esa es la diferencia
Oh,
que vemos del convivir que estamos ahora con el pasado. Ese es como se le llama el arte. El arte de antes con el de ahora.
this is now the interference with the art from before to the one now. That creates an impact because you had per se there was influence, yes. We walked in that day of the exhibit that morning, and we saw all his paintings and all the artifacts. So for us, it was like, wow, you have artists from the past and you have an artist from the present, and the pieces that he created, of course, were in
Reflection or response.
of the artifacts that were there. So it was a combination between two artists or two different arts.
It was
From
like
the
the
same-
past was talking to the future.
Exactly, yes. See, you understand more than- But it was a big impact. It was
Which is
amazing.
exactly what I wanted. So happy to hear that.
Ahora digo algo bien importante, lo más bello de cada uno de nosotros aquí es que todos dejamos un impacto a nuestras vidas o impactamos a otras personas.
This is one of the most beautiful things of all of us being here is because we create an impact among other people depending on what we do. But all of us can create an impact
Con su trabajo,
with your work,
su talento,
with your talent,
con su imaginación.
with your imagination.
Pero imagínate, juntas todo eso,
But imagine put all that together,
así es como un meteorito cuando impacta la Tierra.
you make a meteor and it impacts her. So all of us, we definitely can make an impact.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
happy holidays.
So to follow up with that, we also had a feedback call, so I got to hear back from other people too visiting. And to date, we still haven't logged them all. We're up to 3,000 responses, and I still have a box about yay big. My interns are wonderful, lovely people, and I'm so glad they're there to do that. And the last thing we did after that is because this is theirs, and they should celebrate the fact that they're going back. We had a big celebration at the end. With Aztec dancers were fabulous, and if it wasn't for Susie and Jose, this would not have gone off. So, but it was a great day, very colorful food, friends, family, and it was very, very happy. And you can see Jose and Susie at the end. I think they approved of the day. So. And I'd love to hear what you have to say. Any questions, discussion? Yes?
When I first met with you, you and I talked a little bit about the relationships that going throughout this repatriation process built with the Mexican embassy. I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and I think everybody would be.
Yeah, I think I'm family there now. It was sort of a circuitous route. I wound up talking to the consulate in Albuquerque first. She retired or went on to another job and then brought us over to Atlanta. And from there, I'm now good friends with Javier, who's the general consulate, and Marco, who's my contact between us. And we've been, they're just the greatest, friendliest people. They've been super supportive. They helped us all. Any questions I had, they got back to me a little slowly sometimes, but that's okay. But they've been nothing but supportive and helpful the whole way through. They were a little, they did underestimate what I was sending to them. So 255 objects translates to 31 boxes. 2 of them are big wooden crates. Marco thought he could drive up in a Nissan Rogue and pick that up. And I was like, that's not gonna fly, buddy. So that kind of messed up their budget because he thought he could just do that. So he's like, well, I don't know when we're going to get this, and I don't know, da, da, da. And I'm like, you know what, we're going to drive it down. So me and my friend, my colleague Katie Henson, who was a big part of the design of this exhibit, her and Jennifer Richardson, who's the actual curator of the Parthenon, I have an awesome team, by the way. Me and her drove down to Atlanta and brought that stuff to them, and they still have it for now because they don't have it. It's going to get flown to Mexico and then brought to the Institute of Anthropology and History, where they're going to study it and display it at some point. But if it hadn't been for them and their support, I would have never gotten any of that done at all. So. And they picked the museum. This is how they do the process. You send them a bunch of pictures, they analyze them, and then everything that's if you go through the consulate, and it goes to INA. If you were to go directly through another museum, from museum to museum, I'm not sure how that process would go, actually. I do know that museums in Mexico are quite full, so it might have been a much more difficult situation. But I also don't know which museums I would send these to, because I don't know exactly where in Mexico they came from. So.
With repatriation, having the willingness to return something to its country, what opportunities does that create between different museums in different countries?
That's a good question. The problem with repatriation is museums don't know what to do. So seeing us do it gives them, I hope, a starting point. They can contact me, and I've had many museums contact me and ask me, what do we do? And I give them my insight, and we talk and I help them and do research. But I'm hoping that it will get people to communicate more and ask more questions and see that it can be done and not just be like, nope, that's too hard. But to actually see, hey, if this tiny museum, this government museum can do it, then we can too. So I've had a number of museums contact me to do that. Does that answer your question?
I was thinking more of the lines of opening dialogue, yes,
Yeah.
but also being able to share artifacts between things around the world.
Yeah, that's a solution. That's part of the solution thing, perhaps communication regarding like trading things, trading loans, stuff like that. But what's important is knowing who owns it first, and then you can, once you've established those relationships, then perhaps it'll make borrowing and trading much more easier to do. Yes?
Could you repeat, please, how and when these artifacts became the property of the museum?
So we received them from Dr. John Montgomery, a doctor from Oregon. He was ornithologist, thank you. He, for my paperwork, it said that he went to Mexico, picked the stuff up, and brought it, made friends with Parker, and started donating them between throughout the 1960s. Let's put it that way. However, after all of this went national, I got a call from his son in Texas. Turns out John Montgomery didn't send any of that stuff. He didn't go to Mexico at all except to party. He sent his sons. His sons got a Subaru, put a false bottom in it, drove to Mexico, and bought the stuff off of farmers and locals. And that's how they got the stuff. Filled up the truck, the Subaru, and then brought it back. There was a law in Mexico, 1816, it was official, that you couldn't do this kind of thing. However, no one cared. No one did anything about it. All they cared about at that time, Mexico or the United States, well, the United States cared more about guns traveling across the border. But if it had turquoise or gold, if it was sexy, splashy, that's when they would care. Otherwise, a pot, who cares? A bunch of shards, little character like that looks like Squidward. They weren't interested. So he would bring it up, give it to his dad. His dad would get them appraised for a price, sell them to a friend, and they would donate them to a museum for donation. And he would get tax deductions. It was all for tax deductions. It's how actually Rich, his son, paid for college.
Wow.
And he did it about 10 times over the years.
What was that conversation with the son like when he reached out to you?
First, I was terrified.
Or when you were saying that, like that sounds like a social anxiety hotbed.
Yes,
So I would
no,
love
my
to-
anxiety was about here. One of the things about this exhibit is I really wanted to get some of that negative feel of repatriation out and be more positive about it. So I was a little concerned. I had tried to find the Montgomery family and Edgar York for 2 years plus the people who came before me tried to find him. Nobody could find him, so this guy came out of the blue. So I was a little hesitant. But he's the nicest guy on the planet. He was so excited to tell me about how they actually got to the museum. He doesn't like his dad at all. So he was totally willing to throw him under the bus. He was just, it was a grand adventure to him. So he really loved telling me all his stories. And his stories were so great that I'm actually, as part of this, there's a professor at the Denver, Colorado University. His name's Dr. Christopher Beekman. He's actually prominent in the West Mexican artifacts. And he was a Vanderbilt student that did study our artifacts, so I was able to go back to him. He is also working with the Getty Museum to get oral histories just like Rich Montgomery's. So I got them in contact, so they have recorded his stories for forever. Because he's in his late 80s, and he told me, I'm never leaving Texas again. So, like, okay. So we have his stories recorded, but like, yeah, it was a very interesting conversation. He was super friendly, super happy to talk to anybody about it. And his stories should be in a book, I think. He could write a really fascinating book.
Was he happy to see that they were going
Yeah.
back? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love that.
Yeah, so do I. So, but I've never heard, it was a shot in the dark to hear from them, and I still have a secret hope that someone from Edgar will contact us, but I doubt it, because that transaction happened in the 70s, clearly after UNESCO was passed. And it was done in a very shady exchange in a hotel room kind of way. So I don't think I'll be hearing from them. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Like as the organization repatriating objects, artifacts elsewhere, it's going to be a sense of like big responsibility that wherever they end up is a safe, good home for them. So were you able to be part of that conversation about their ultimate home, or was the understanding that you repatriated to the Mexican government, this is where they're going to go?
Yeah, it was, they're being repatriated, this is where it's going to go, and I was okay with that because I really didn't know where else to send them. I can only tell you they come from West Mexico, the regions of Jalisco, Colima, and Nayarit. After that, I got nothing. My friend there, I know most likely comes from Colima because there are very similar pieces just like, almost exactly like him. That guy, nobody knows. I actually surprised everyone when I noticed that it's actually a male-female character. It's not just one sex. And it actually has some fragments, I brought them if you'd like to take a look, that are supposed to go on the head. But I don't know why. I don't know what its purpose for, what its use was. And that's part of the reason why we picked it to 3D print, because we can give it to children and say, can you put this together and then what do you think it is? Because we don't. So it gives them an idea of what it's like to be an archaeologist, to figure things out. So. But yeah, I lucked out in that regard, I think, because that would have been a mess, I think. Anything else? Yes?
So it sounds like you had a lot of barriers while trying to do this from like a local government type of position that you're in. Do you know of other governments that are trying to copy this and, be part of more repatriation efforts?
I don't, actually. The museum, people I've heard from have only been museums. I do know that Italy has its own, they call them the art squad. They go around and they try to find artifacts, and they've returned, I think, something around 3,000 to 4,000 artifacts to Mexico, just to Mexico, that they found. So I know they're working on it, and they're actually working with Mexico to create their own art squad to do the same. But Otherwise, you just hear about NAGPRA. That's a bit of a mess. But yeah, no, it's really weird. There's no blueprint, and the government doesn't seem to know what to do either, so they're kind of hoping the museums just figure it out on their own, I think. But I don't have an answer, sorry. Anyone else? Okay, I thank you.